The year was 1587, an era when the Atlantic Ocean was not merely a body of water, but a vast, terrifying, and rhythmic expanse that held the dreams of an empire in its deep blue lungs. In the late spring of that year, 3 small ships, the Silver Fleet of the Elizabethan Age, cut through the salt-heavy air of the North Carolina coast. These vessels, though weathered by months of Atlantic storms, moved with a slow, deliberate grace toward a small sliver of land known as Roanoke Island. On board were 115 souls, men with calloused hands, women with tired eyes, and children who watched the horizon with a mixture of wonder and exhaustion. Among them was John White, an artist and a mapmaker, whose mission was not to conquer with the sword, but to document a new world with the brush and the quill. As the ships neared the shallow, turquoise waters of the Outer Banks, the sound of the ocean changed. The deep, rolling roar of the open sea was replaced by the gentle, repetitive lap of the tide against the sandy shoals, a sound that would become the heartbeat of their new, fragile reality. The first breath of the shore. When the anchors finally dropped, the sound of the heavy iron chains hitting the water echoed across the silent dunes. It was a rhythmic, metallic clatter that signaled the end of a grueling voyage and the beginning of a profound isolation. The air here was different from the soot-heavy air of London. It was thick with the scent of cedar, salt spray, and a strange, sweet humidity that seemed to slow time itself. The settlers stepped off the longboats and onto the soft white sand of Roanoke. The feeling of the earth beneath their feet was a sensory shock. No longer was the world swaying and unstable. It was firm, ancient, and indifferent. They were at the very edge of the known world, a thin strip of forest and sand caught between the infinite Atlantic and the unexplored depths of the American wilderness. John White stood on the dunes, watching his people. He noticed the way they moved, slowly, almost in a trance, as they began to carry their meager belongings from the shore to the ruins of a fort left behind by a previous military expedition. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and amber. The birds of the island, strange and colorful, began their evening chorus, a repetitive, melodic cycle of calls that added to the boring and peaceful atmosphere of their first night. The architecture of survival. The first weeks on Roanoke were defined by the boring rhythm of labor. There was the rhythmic thud of axes against cedar logs, the scratching of hoes against the sandy soil, and the steady, rhythmic splashing of water being drawn from the shallow wells. Life was measured not in minutes, but in the amount of daylight remaining and the steady pulse of the tides. The settlers rebuilt the small wooden cottages. The sounds of construction were not chaotic. They were a steady, hypnotic cadence that blended with the environment. The wind moved through the tall, marshy grasses with a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh. For a mother putting her child to sleep in a cabin made of fresh timber, the world consisted only of the smell of wood smoke and the distant, eternal white noise of the Atlantic surf. John White spent his days mapping the inlets. He watched how the water moved, how the currents shifted the sandbars into new patterns every day. He realized that the island was not a static piece of land, but a living, shifting entity. His maps were not just geography. They were an attempt to find order in a world that felt increasingly ethereal. The ink on his vellum dried slowly in the humid air, each stroke of his pen a silent meditation on the isolation of his colony. The birth of Virginia Dare. In August of that first year, the colony witnessed a moment of fragile hope. Eleanor Dare, White's daughter, gave birth to a daughter, the first English child born on American soil. They named her Virginia. The sound of the infant's first cry was a brief interruption in the silence of the woods. For the settlers, this was a sign that the land might finally accept them. But even this joy was tempered by the overwhelming quiet of the surrounding forest. The trees, mostly ancient oaks and towering pines, stood like silent sentinels around the small clearing. They seemed to be watching the newcomers with a patience that only the earth can possess. The night Virginia Dare was born, a heavy fog rolled in from the sound. It was a silver mist that erased the horizon and muffled all sound. The colony felt as though it had been lifted from the earth and placed in a void. There was no England, no war, no history, only the soft breathing of a newborn and the thick, damp silence of the Roanoke fog. The decision of the manifest. Despite the birth of the child, the colony's supplies were dwindling. The soil was sandy and reluctant to yield the familiar crops of Europe. The boring reality of hunger began to settle in. It was a slow, dull ache that mirrored the gray skies of autumn. The settlers realized they could not survive the winter without help from the crown. John White was chosen to return to England for supplies. It was a decision made in the quiet of the night over a single candle in the governor's cabin. He did not want to leave his daughter or his granddaughter, but the logic of survival was as cold and unyielding as the Atlantic. Before he left, White established a code, a manifest of silence. If the settlers were forced to leave the island due to danger, they were to carve the name of their destination on a tree or a post. If they were in distress, they were to add a cross above the name. It was a simple geometric instruction meant to bridge the gap between two worlds that were thousands of miles apart. On the morning of his departure, the sea was uncharacteristically calm, a flat silver mirror that reflected the pale sky. White climbed into the longboat, looking back at the small cluster of wooden houses. He saw Eleanor standing on the shore, holding the infant. The image was a portrait of stillness. The waves barely broke against the sand. The only sound was the rhythmic dip of the oars into the water, a sound that would haunt White's dreams for the next 3 years. As his ship, the Hopewell, caught the morning breeze and began its slow journey back across the infinite blue, the colony of Roanoke faded into the mist. It was no longer a place of noise and movement. It was a silent dot on a vast, shifting map. The Silver Fleet was leaving, and the cipher of the coast was beginning to close around the 115 souls who remained. They were now the keepers of the island's silence, waiting for a return that the ocean would conspire to delay.
While the settlers on Roanoke Island were adjusting to the profound isolation of the New World, John White was thrust into a different kind of imprisonment, a bureaucratic and maritime stalemate in England. The 3 years he spent away from his family were not filled with action, but with the agonizing, boring passage of time. It was a period defined by the rhythmic tapping of rain against window panes in London and the endless gray swells of the English Channel. The Great Stasis of 1588. When White arrived back in England in late 1587, he expected a quick turnaround. He imagined himself loading the Hopewell with grain, tools, and warm clothing, and returning to his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, before her first birthday. But history has a way of slowing down at the most critical moments. England was on the brink of war with Spain. Queen Elizabeth I had issued a stay of shipping, a royal decree that prohibited any capable vessel from leaving English waters. The Spanish Armada was coming, and every ship, no matter how small, was needed for the defense of the realm. White found himself a prisoner of the shore. He spent his days walking the docks of Portsmouth and Plymouth, watching the massive warships being outfitted for battle. The sound of the era was not the sound of discovery, but the repetitive, rhythmic clatter of shipwrights' hammers and the dull roar of the coastal winds. For White, the Atlantic was no longer a highway. It was a wall of moving water, thousands of miles thick, separating him from the faces he loved. He lived in a state of temporal suspension. Every morning he would check the direction of the wind. A westerly wind meant no ship could leave for America. He watched the weather vanes of London with a hypnotic intensity, his life dictated by the invisible currents of the atmosphere. The boring reality of war is often not the combat, but the endless waiting in damp rooms, reading old manifests, and listening to the city's bells mark hours that felt like days. The failed relief and the echo of the sea. In the spring of 1588, White made a desperate attempt to return. He managed to secure two small, poorly equipped pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe. These were not ships meant for the mid-Atlantic, but White was driven by a quiet, desperate urgency. However, the sea was indifferent to his plight. The ships were intercepted by French pirates, stripped of their supplies, and forced to return to England. This failure marked the beginning of the long silence. White returned to a London that was consumed by the victory over the Spanish Armada, but for him, the celebration was hollow. He moved through the crowded streets like a ghost. The noise of the city, the shouting of vendors, the clatter of carriages on cobblestones was nothing compared to the silence he imagined was growing on Roanoke Island. He spent his evenings in his study, looking at the watercolors he had painted of the New World. He stared at the image of the silver fleet anchored in the Sound, trying to remember the exact shade of the water and the specific way the light hit the cedars at sunset. He was a man living in a memory loop, trapped between the reality of a gray London and the fading colors of a distant island. The rhythmic despair of the Atlantic. To understand White's 3-year absence, one must understand the boring nature of 16th century maritime logistics. Information moved at the speed of a sail. A letter from the coast to London could take a week. A ship's repair could take months. Every delay was a layer of dust settling over the fate of the colony. White began to keep a journal, not of events, but of observations of the sea. He wrote about the endless breadth of the Atlantic, how the tide rose and fell with a mechanical, unthinking regularity. He saw the ocean as a giant, indifferent beast that didn't care about the 115 souls on Roanoke. The repetition of the waves became a metaphor for his own life, a constant, rhythmic movement that ultimately led nowhere. The silence from Roanoke was absolute. There were no messages, no returning ships, no whispers carried by traders. In the mind of the English public, the colony was becoming a forgotten experiment, a footnote in the grander narrative of the war with Spain. But for White, the silence was a physical weight. It was a heavy quiet that sat in his chest during the long, dark winters of 1589 and early 1590. The final thaw. Finally, in March of 1590, the bureaucratic wheels turned. White was given permission to join a privateering expedition led by John Watts. He wasn't the commander this time. He was a passenger on a mission of profit. The ships, the Hopewell and the Moonlight, moved slowly down the Thames. As they hit the open sea, White felt a strange lack of relief. The 3 years had changed him. He was older, his hair turned to the color of the Atlantic fog. The endless breadth of the Atlantic was now familiar to him, a low-frequency hum that had become the background music of his life. He sat on the deck for hours, watching the horizon, his eyes fixed on the west. The voyage back was not fast. The ships stopped in the West Indies to hunt for Spanish prizes, a boring and repetitive process of waiting and watching the horizon for sails. For White, every day spent chasing gold was a day of betrayal to the people waiting in the trees. He listened to the creak of the ship's timbers, a sound that had become his only constant companion. It was a rhythmic groaning prayer for a colony that had been left alone for 1,101 days. The Atlantic was finally allowing him to cross, but the silence he was heading towards was deeper and more profound than anything he had experienced in London. The cipher of the coast was waiting, and the post on Roanoke was ready to reveal its solitary carved word.
On the evening of August 15th, 1590, the Hopewell and the Moonlight finally dropped anchor off the northern end of Roanoke Island. The return was not marked by the joyful firing of cannons or the sound of trumpets. Instead, the arrival was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive, humid heat and a thick, yellowish haze of smoke rising from the island's interior. John White stood at the railing, his eyes straining against the twilight, searching for the familiar flicker of a signal fire. There was none, only the rhythmic crashing of the surf against the outer banks broke the absolute silence of the coast. The next morning, the search began. This was the moment White had rehearsed in his mind for 3 long years, yet the reality was a boring and surreal nightmare of stillness. The landing party rowed toward the shore, the rhythmic dip of the oars making the only sound in the vast, salt-heavy air. As they stepped onto the sand, White noted that the grass had grown tall and wild, erasing the paths he had once mapped with such precision. The island was reclaiming itself. The ghost of the settlement. As the men moved inland toward the site of the colony, the atmosphere grew increasingly dense. The forest was thick with the scent of cedar and rotting vegetation. There was no sound of children playing, no rhythmic thud of an axe, no smell of cooking fires. The silence was not empty. It was a heavy silence, a physical presence that seemed to push against their chests. When they reached the clearing where the settlement had stood, they found not a scene of massacre, but a scene of total, orderly abandonment. The cottages had been taken down, their heavy timbers removed, as if the inhabitants had moved with purpose rather than fled in fear. The area was overgrown with weeds and vines that curled around the remaining hearthstones like skeletal fingers. White walked through the tall grass, his heart beating a slow, hollow rhythm. He looked for the 7-star arrangement of the houses, but the geometry was gone. The world he had left behind had been dismantled. There were no bodies, no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the 115 souls had simply evaporated into the humid air, leaving only the boring and repetitive sound of the wind whistling through the empty palisade. The cipher on the tree. The search party moved toward the entrance of the palisade, the defensive wall of sharpened logs that White had ordered built before his departure. It was here that they found the first clue. On a tree at the edge of the clearing, the bark had been stripped away and 3 letters had been carved into the wood. C-R-O. White stared at the letters. They were deep and deliberate, the work of a hand that was not trembling. There was no cross, the sign of distress he had instructed them to leave. The absence of that simple geometric mark was a profound relief, yet it added to the deepening mystery. Why leave only a fragment of a word?
They continued toward the main gate. There, on one of the primary support posts of the fort, they found the full word carved in large capital letters, Croatoan. The letters were weathered by 3 years of coastal storms, but they remained clear. White traced the indentations with his fingers. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and the name of the friendly indigenous tribe that lived there. The message was a cipher of destination. It suggested a planned relocation, a move toward the south. But as White looked around the empty, silent fort, the word felt less like a signpost and more like an incantation, a word that had swallowed a whole community, the ruin of the archives. The most devastating discovery for White was the fate of his personal belongings. He found several of his heavy sea chests buried in a trench, but they had been dug up and ransacked. His beautiful watercolors, his maps of the New World, and his books were scattered across the dirt, rotted by the rain and chewed by the island's insects. The boring and meticulous work of his life, the documentation of the colony, was now a pile of moldering pulp. This was the true silence of the archives. The history of Roanoke was being erased by the elements, one page at a time. As he picked up a scrap of vellum that had once been a map, it crumbled in his hand, the ink turning to dust. The island was not just taking the people, it was taking their memory. The call of the storm. As the sun began to set on that first day of discovery, a sudden, violent shift occurred in the weather. The Atlantic's breath turned into a roar. A northeaster began to blow, the wind howling through the empty palisade with a haunting, flute-like sound. The ships anchored in the treacherous shoals were in danger of being driven onto the rocks. The search was cut short. The rhythmic urgency of the storm replaced the slow, investigative pace of the afternoon. White was forced to return to the Hopewell, his boots heavy with the sand of a colony that existed only as a carved word. As the longboat pulled away from the shore, he looked back at the dark silhouette of the trees. The word Croatoan was still there, hidden in the shadows of the fort, a silent sentinel over an empty land. The search party had found the cipher, but they had not found the souls. The cipher of the coast had remained intact. The colony was gone, and as the storm-driven waves began to wash over the shore, the 3-year wait transformed into an eternal mystery. The 115 people of Roanoke were no longer citizens of England. They were now ghosts of the forest, their voices lost in the rhythmic, eternal sigh of the North Carolina pines.
The disappearance of the Roanoke settlers did not end with John White's forced departure in 1590. Instead, it transitioned from a military crisis into a century-long whisper, a boring and slow-moving mystery that drifted through the marshlands and cypress swamps of North Carolina. For decades, the English crown and the later settlers of Jamestown heard stories of a lost people, a group of shadows that had moved not back toward the sea, but deeper into the humid green heart of the continent. This part of the history is defined by the Lumbee shadows. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, explorers venturing into the swampy interior of what is now Robeson County encountered a group of indigenous people who defied every expectation of the era. These people, who would later be known as the Lumbee, possessed features that were an impossible bridge between two worlds. Many had gray or blue eyes, fair skin, and light brown hair, features that shimmered like ghosts against the dark, tannin-stained waters of the swamps. The genetic echo in the marsh.
To hear the stories of these blue-eyed tribes is to enter a world of acoustic and visual ambiguity. The explorers noted that these people did not speak in the tonal languages of the surrounding Algonquian or Iroquoian tribes. Instead, they spoke an archaic, rhythmic form of English, a boring and repetitive dialect that sounded like the echoes of Elizabethan London filtered through a century of forest silence. John White's Croatoan Cipher had pointed south, and it was in this southern direction that the genetic memory of Roanoke seemed to have settled. The Lumbee legends spoke of their ancestors who came from the sea and talked out of a book. These stories weren't grand epics of war. They were quiet domestic memories of weaving, of building wooden houses, and of planting crops in the sandy soil. The lost colony had not been destroyed, it had been absorbed. It was a biological assimilation, a slow-motion blending of cultures that occurred in the deep, quiet shade of the ancient pines. The architecture of the hidden villages. The villages of these shadow people were described as being different from the standard nomadic camps of the region. They featured semi-permanent structures that utilized European-style wattle and daub techniques, interwoven branches smeared with clay, a technique that mirrored the cottages White had seen dismantled on Roanoke Island. The sound of these villages was a rhythmic, peaceful drone, the sound of looms at work, the steady grinding of corn, and the low-frequency humming of songs that carried the faint, distorted melodies of English hymns. For the 115 souls of Roanoke, survival meant becoming a part of the rhythmic cycle of the swamp. They traded their woolen doublets for deerskin, their iron tools for stone, and their written history for a spoken one. The forest was not their enemy, it was their sanctuary. The boring and repetitive nature of daily life in the swamp, the rise and fall of the tides in the estuaries, the migration of the birds, the seasonal change of the cypress leaves, became the new manifest for the survivors. They were the silent inheritors of a new land, living in a state of historical invisibility that protected them from the wars of the surface world. The mystery of the gray-eyed chief. By the early 1700s, legendary accounts reached the colonial governors of a gray-eyed chief who led a powerful confederation in the interior. This leader was said to possess a silver medallion and a chain of English make, a relic of a grandfather who had come from the island of the lost. This medallion was not a treasure of gold, but a piece of acoustic memory. When struck, it rang with the same metallic tone as the tools from the silent anvil forge. It was a physical connection to the cipher of the coast. These stories, however, were often dismissed by the colonial authorities as mere boring folklore. The authorities wanted land and clear borders. They had no room for a history that was fluid, blended, and hidden in the mist. As the 18th century progressed, the blue eyes of the swamp people began to fade into the broader population, but the shadow remained. The Roanoke settlers had become a genetic cipher, a code written into the blood of the Lumbee people. They were the living answer to the carving on the post, a community that had chosen to vanish into the landscape rather than perish in the fort. They had traded their English identity for a permanent existence in the American wilderness, becoming the first true Americans, a people born of the sea, raised by the swamp, and protected by the absolute silence of the North Carolina interior. The mystery of Roanoke did not dissolve into the soil of the 16th century. Instead, it became a permanent resident of the American coastline, a coastal ghost that continues to haunt the scientific and historical imagination of the modern world. Today, the Outer Banks of North Carolina remain a place of shifting sands and boring geological movements, where the Atlantic Ocean constantly tries to rewrite the map. For the modern observer, the silence of the island is no longer a void. It is a complex, layered archive waiting to be read. The archaeology of the invisible. In the 21st century, the search for the lost colony has shifted from the surface of the Earth to the deep, silent layers of the substrata. Archaeologists using advanced ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have discovered that the Roanoke of 1587 was not a fixed point, but a moving target. The island itself is migrating, drifting slowly toward the mainland as the ocean pushes the sandbars. Underneath the tall beach grasses and the twisted oaks, researchers have found anomalous deposits, fragments of Elizabethan pottery, English flint, and copper beads that shouldn't exist in the middle of a swamp. These artifacts are the boring proof of presence. They are not grand treasures, but everyday objects: a broken pipkin, a rusted sewing needle, a single button from a woolen doublet. These small, mundane items carry the weight of 115 souls. They tell a story of a people who didn't die in a single catastrophic event, but who lived through the boring and repetitive struggle of survival, one day at a time. The unfinished map that John White left behind has become a digital one. Modern mappers have found that the X marks and the patches of paper on White's original watercolors hide hidden fortifications. Under a patch of paper on the famous Virginia Pars map, a small blue and red fort symbol was discovered, a cartographic secret that had been hidden for over 400 years. It suggests that White knew more than he could say, or perhaps he was leaving a secret trail for those who would come after him. The acoustic memory of the sound. If you stand on the shores of Roanoke Island at twilight, you can still hear the acoustic memory of the colony. It is not the sound of voices, but the rhythmic, hypnotic pulse of the environment. The sound of the wind through the pines, a sound that has remained unchanged for 4 centuries, creates a frequency that mimics the sound of distant conversation. This is the auditory mirage, a psychological phenomenon where the brain tries to find human patterns in the boring white noise of the forest. The legend of the coastal ghost is not about a vengeful spirit, but about the stasis of history. The colony is lost only because we seek a definitive ending in a world that prefers a slow, integrated transition. The 115 settlers didn't vanish into thin air. They vanished into the genetic and cultural landscape. They became the fog, the salt spray, and the blue eyes of the swamp dwellers. They are the silent architects of the first American identity, a mixture of English stubbornness and indigenous wisdom. The ocean, however, remains the ultimate keeper of the secret. The graveyard of the Atlantic, as this coastline is known, holds more than just shipwrecks. It holds the final pieces of the Roanoke puzzle. Every time a major hurricane strikes the Outer Banks, the shifting sands reveal new clues: a piece of timber, a stone hearth, or a lead-weighted fishing line from a bygone era. The ocean's ledger is boring and slow to reveal its entries. It requires a patience that matches the 3-year wait of John White. The cipher of the coast is still being decoded, one grain of sand at a time. For the listener drifting into sleep, the story of Roanoke is a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be inhabited. It is a story of eternal waiting, a rhythmic cycle of arrival, departure, and eventual integration into the infinite. As the moon rises over the Outer Banks, casting its pale silver light over the empty palisade and the silent dunes, the word Croatoan remains etched into the collective memory of a nation. The 7-star ships of the Elizabethan age are gone, but their echoes remain in the rhythmic lap of the tide. The colony is at rest, protected by the silver mist and the absolute beautiful silence of the North Carolina night. The manifest is closed, the map is unfinished, and the mystery of Roanoke remains, a quiet sentinel over the very beginning of the American dream.